let you guys.
Sure. Thanks. So just a little bit about us. We work at a place called the Penn Group. We're a bipartisan, primarily education-focused lobbying firm in Capitol Hill. Both of us, Karen and I, spent many years, although me a few more years than you, right? We have this joke. Anyway, never mind. I said to Kara one time that we are of the same generation, and she didn't like that because I'm older than her. So I'm much older than Kara is. But both of us have spent a long time on Capitol Hill. We both worked for the House side, most recently for George Miller from California, for those California people who are here, on the Education Committee. And we also have, so we're Democrats, but we have Republican colleagues, people who worked in the administration, Clinton, Bush, different administrations and stuff like that. So we really approach kind of issues as what is your policy goal and how do you want accomplishment? What are the tools and what are the levers we need to push to help whoever the particular client, in this case Janet and GIA, who wanted to advance arts education policy through federal law. What do we need to do to have the right message and the right tools and the right policy to go forward on it? So we've been working together about 2.5, 3 years now, I think, and we've actually started to really show a lot of impact for the work. I'll probably talk about this out of order just for a second. Oh, you can't hear? Can you hear me now if I talk a little bit louder? Are the mics not on? Are the mics on?
I don't think those ones are. Use those.
Is this mic on? No. Is it on now?
There you go.
So I won't go out of order actually because that's not what we talked about. Right? The first thing that Janet came to us with was how we can advance policy in the Elementary and Secondary Education Act Title I, professional development, after-school programs through the 21st Century Community Learning Centers program, big kind of federal pots of money. And working with Janet and the other members of the advisory board of the Arts Education Funders Coalition, we came up with a set of policy agenda items that actually, through the work over the last probably 2.5 years or so, have actually wound up in House and Senate bills. And where we are kind of right now is that the House of Representatives advanced a bill which kind of stalled out on the floor. We can talk about that if someone has questions about it. That included some aspects of our policy agenda in Title I and Title II. Important to point out there that, remember, this is the House of Representatives controlled by Republicans, so we were able to talk Republican members and staff into including some of our agenda, which is they're not anti-arts education. It's just not something they gravitate towards at the federal level. So it's just something to point out. On the Senate side, their bill's been through committee, where it's also controlled by Republicans, but Democrats have an important role in that process, more so than I think the House side, just because of the way the Senate's structured. And we also have important provisions on our agenda in Title I and Title II, essentially ensuring that, much like the work that Richard talked about in California, making sure that in the law it says that people can use Title I money for arts education, making sure that professional development includes arts educators, making sure that when you're doing your Title I and Title II plans, or how you're going to essentially spend the money at the state and school district level, you're thinking about how arts education fits in there. And one of the things I think we settled on a long time ago with Janet was we wanted this to be more systemic. We didn't want to necessarily just say, let's look for this funding or that funding. We want big pots of federal money out there to be connected and to be able to be used for arts education in a way that state and local people, not necessarily us, in Washington D.C., but can take these provisions as tools and actually get real policy advancements at a systemic level in your state, in your school district, wherever you happen to be focused. So I think the fortunate thing is between the House and Senate bills, we have just about, and I should mention too, the after-school program, big $1 billion after-school program, or expanded learning time program is probably a better way to talk about it. Includes a focus on the arts now as well in the bills that we're talking about. And so all this essentially means that, there's nothing guaranteed because it's Congress. We tell that all the time. Congress is able to snatch success from the jaws of, or snatch defeat from the jaws of success all the time. But there's a lot of momentum to get this done in Congress right now, and our agenda, the GIA, Arts Education Funders Coalition agenda, is heavily embedded in both the House and Senate bills. So we feel real positive about where that's going. So, and I think you were going to talk about pre-K.
Sure. So another area that we're really excited about is pre-K programs and getting arts education embedded into those programs. And you know, you may have heard there's a lot of gridlock in Congress right now. So it's exciting when we get to talk about some of the good things that are happening and the movement forward. And pre-K is one of those areas. There were bills in both the House and Senate to, and actually I'll back up. This started with a proposal from President Obama in his budget to fund pre-K preschool development grants that would give money to states for real systemic change around pre-K and pre-K systems. There were efforts in both the House and the Senate to authorize that program and to make it a law. In both of those efforts, we were able to get arts education as recognized as a requirement for early learning, which was very exciting. Unfortunately, back to the gridlock, those bills never went anywhere. But thankfully, that's not the end of this story. We did have appropriations, and through the appropriations process, there was funding for preschool development grants. This was an administration priority, so they had pushed for it. When the language went through on implementation, originally they were not going to include arts education as a requirement for learning. But through some of our work, we were able to influence that and get the requirement in there, so that's moving forward. There's been 2 years of funding. 18 states have received funding, and over the 2 years, it's $500 million, I believe. And then, you know, those are some of our past accomplishments and what we're working on going forward with ESEA, but things that are really churning. And then some of the things that we're looking to in the future include work on the Older Americans Act. So this is moving away from the K through 12 and the early space and looking at seniors and how we can influence and bring the arts and arts education into that world as well. The Older Americans Act is also up for reauthorization. It has been for, I think, at least a year. And we're currently working with staff, both committees in the Senate and the House, to incorporate some language into that legislation. Again, we're looking at the systemic approach, so looking at putting it into state plans, into their version of local plans, which is through AAA's, Area Agencies on Aging, and also getting it in senior centers and some of the senior community programs. And so that's really on the agenda moving forward. They haven't really picked up too much traction last year. They did pass a bill in the Senate, but it didn't go anywhere. And this year, they've been talking about it. They've had some hearings, but no movement yet. But we're actively engaged with the committee staff on that.
And I should add that on all that stuff, you know, especially on the preschool development grants, when we encountered both Congress and first the administration, it was actually kind of bizarre to us because we naturally thought, oh, here's this preschool program. Head Start already includes the arts as a kind of component of how kids learn. Of course they'll include it. No, we actually had to talk them into it, which was kind of surprising for us. But you now have $500 million in new federal money that went out to states, money that wasn't there before. They actually have arts as a required kind of element for one of the most important populations, really, really young kids. So as Kara mentioned, too, and thinking more, again, on the systemic route, like how do we embed this in existing funding efforts that are out there, this concept of furthering arts education and its use. The other area that we mentioned is juvenile justice or juvenile delinquency programs. You have a number of efforts, surprisingly most bipartisan, at the congressional level to focus in on both funding and policy around services for juveniles who are either court involved or who are at risk of being court involved or in some sort of at risk of some sort of delinquent behavior. Two main kind of statutes in Congress govern that. There's something called the Second Chance Act, which is a more recent law in the past couple of years, as well as the Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention Act, which is several decades in the making. Both of them provide resources to states, to tribes, to local governments to help with some of these efforts. One of the things that GIA identified for us, as well as the members of the advisory committee of the Arts Education Funders Coalition, was a real need to focus in on how do we systemically embed the arts as a way to reach out just to some kids in juvenile delinquency programs. That is probably the least furthest along because Congress just hasn't gotten around to kind of getting there yet. I should say, though, that there's a growing kind of acknowledgement in Congress, led up by bipartisan leaders, Rob Portman, who's a senator from Ohio who occasionally gets talked about as a candidate for either president or vice president. He's a Republican, as well as Pat Leahy and other members, a senator from Vermont, Democrat, have really led a charge on trying to address some of these issues. So this may be something that kind of starts to heat up a little bit in the fall and next year, and where actually members start looking at, okay, what can we do? And we've talked to the staff. They know it's an issue, and I think the biggest thing we've tried to do with staff and members up there is to get them to see arts education not as just a separate program or some add-on, but to think about it systemically and how do they fit it into everything they do. If you're going to do an education program, don't just, how does arts fit in? Not should arts fit in? Should it be an add-on? Should it be this? That should be the other? We're really we spent a lot of energy, and Janet's been to D.C. a bunch of times to talk about, kind of how important this is to think of the arts being ingrained in what you do when it comes to education, much like some of the comments that we have heard earlier today. Do we have a few minutes to see if there are any questions?
Yeah.
Are there any questions? Maddie.
Have there been opportunities to connect with any Pay for Success initiatives?
So the place where Pay for Success has been most prominent, I guess, has been in the workforce kind of area. That's where it's not just the workforce area. There's obviously the Corporation for National Service Grants. I'm totally blanking on the name.
Oh, AmeriCorps grants?
Yeah, there's the Social Innovation Fund
Yes.
That's out there that has Pay for Success built into it.
To a group of Grantmakers in LA, we're talking really about the early education space, but again, still trying to figure out where the intersection would be.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting policy area that we've talked very briefly with about a year ago with folks at GIA. It's been kind of overtaken by things like ESEA and other things, but there is more and more of a recognition of looking at. Does everyone know what the Pay for Success kind of idea is? I see some people shake their head no. So the concept is, it's kind of like what it sounds like. It's not like here's a bunch of money, go do good things. It's like go do good things and we'll pay you for them. Pay you for success. It's not pay, but the nonprofit model is typically reimbursing people for outcomes and results. The place where it gained the most prominence was in something called the Social Innovation Fund, which is funded through the Corporation for National and Community Service. That's something that the Obama administration brought in, not the corporation, but the Social Innovation Fund, brought in when they first came into office. It has since kind of gone into, it also is in the most recently passed Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, essentially the Federal Department of Labor job training laws that just passed. Some of you may know them better by WIA or JTPA or CETA if you've been around for a while, like me. But it's also there, and people are starting to think about it in other areas. Policymakers are, but it's obviously past the corporation's work. It hasn't really yet caught fire, but there are some groups we work with that definitely want to drive that. Part of the issue there is, results are very important in that model, and you have to be sure about not only can you get results, but what are the results you're striving towards. It's not unlike some of the data we're looking at today. Is access just good enough versus who's actually accessing it, what are they getting out of it, what are the results, what does it lead to, and those sort of things. So beginning conversations, I would say. I think Daniel, you had your hand up if that is still the case.
Maybe you can share your successful strategies to convince these legislators to be more proactive and supportive. What have you actually found to be the message points that are convincing the public?
So I think one of the most important things I think we find with any client, including the work that we do here for you guys, is ensuring repetitiveness of a message. You don't just want to see people once and then be gone. I mean, one of the biggest mistakes I think people make around advocacy is they do annual fly-ins and see people once a year and then don't talk to them at all for the rest of the year, or don't interact with them at all. What we've done, we've had the privilege of doing at GIA, is being in constant contact with folks. I think, so that's more of a strategy perspective. From a message standpoint, I think people are most motivated by some of the data that you were talking about, Daniel, in terms of lack of equity in access and lack of actually being able to ensure that kids universally across the spectrum are getting it. I think that folks are more aware when you go in and talk to them about the fact that kids across the country are getting access or not getting access or not being able to participate or not being benefited because of their zip code or where they happen to live. Well, I guess because of their zip code, because of their location. So, and to be honest with you, that resonates with both Republicans and Democrats. While the Republican offices we work with, this may not be the biggest priority for them, they get it. And I think part of the conversation over No Child Left Behind and thinking about reforms to that and what the kind of accountability system should be in that law has opened people's eyes up to maybe we should be looking at this a little more holistically, and policy should make sure that it doesn't necessarily drive one thing over the other. Kara, I don't know if you want to add.
Yeah, I'd just add that I think for some of the more progressive reformer members, there's a real move, and it's an exciting move in my opinion, to go out of a system-based, time-based system into a learner-based system. And what I mean by that is right now we look at school as how many hours a child sits in a seat, not necessarily on what they learn while they're sitting on in those seats, even though we have assessments and accountability. And they're moving towards competency-based systems and interest-driven systems. And so when you talk about the arts and arts education, it's a natural connection for some members, which we haven't seen in the past. Because of those 21st century skills that the arts programs bring, because of that learning through networks as opposed to just in the four walls of the school. So I think especially as we move forward with education policy, and maybe not so much with this reauthorization, but as we continue to talk through the evolving system of education, that's another hook that I think will be really important as we move forward.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to ask a long-winded question based on the comment you just made. So in our country, we are bifurcated into partisan values, Democrat, Republican. We've heard some of those come out today, like someone said no government funding was used for this arts education program. I'm sure that resonates well with the Republicans. Racial equity and social justice, I'm sure resonates well with the Democrats. Those aren't necessarily messages that cross over. So how do you think about the bipartisan approach? Or if there is no middle, then messaging to the two ends, and sort of builds on Daniel's question around what's the message? What research can we provide to you that helps to reinforce the message to the two spectrums?
So I just want to say you should move to Washington, D.C. because that was the shortest long-winded answer I've ever heard. I'll tell you that. I was getting ready to stand on both feet and brace myself for a second. That was like a minute. That was great. So I would actually say that, yes, there's polarization in politics in America, and you can certainly see it when you turn on the Senate or House floor on a lot of things. The key kind of staff and members that work on education issues, while they may publicly have fights over things, get the need for bipartisan solutions and results on this. I think the equity message around the arts resonates just as much with Republican staff as it does Democratic staff. It might resonate with some Democratic staff more, to be fair. Partially, I think, and Janet's experienced this when she's when we've taken her up to meetings on the Hill. It's not that the Republicans are against this. They're the staff that we meet with. Their analysis is usually like, what can I do? They're more thinking about how far can I go as a staff person representing my side of the aisle on this sort of issue, more so than I'm ideologically opposed. So it's more an issue of how do we work this out and get something done. I don't think this area of education law that we're talking about here is partisan. Education can be partisan. That's why you sometimes see the gridlock we're talking about. But there's not necessarily messages that do and don't work with different people. We're also fortunate, to be frank with you here, Janet and GIA is located in Seattle, Washington. Patty Murray is senator from Washington State, who's up for re-election, if I can just get a little political for a second, who certainly is happy to help out a fellow Seattleite. Lamar Alexander has Nashville in his state and understands the arts are very, very important. I mean, that's just picking on the Senate side a little bit. There are other members. The main staff person that works on these issues, Leanne, is a big dancer and understands the arts quite a bit. So there are people that get these issues in their personal lives and in their professional representational lives. And so it's not as much partisan on this sort of issue. Not that Congress isn't partisan on it.
Yeah, and I would just add that, when an issue becomes partisan, it's not that everyone has to love the idea of it. They just have to not stand in the way. So if you have an advocate for it, which we have been lucky enough to have on both sides, and I would say Senator Murray herself and her staff have been advocates, and on the House side, we have Congresswoman Bonamici, who has been a real advocate. She sits on the committee. And also Congressman Bobby Scott has not been opposed to it. So even though you might not have that huge hooray from both sides of the aisle, as long as they're not trying to stop you, it's okay.
Daniel.
I commented in the presentation about the focus of arts education relative to Black and Latino populations. Can you give us some insight as to the interest in this topic by Black and Latino legislators, and why are they so, in your estimation, noticeably absent from the conversation?
That's a good question. The champions for this in Congress are not the members of the Congressional Black Caucus and not the members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus. I truthfully don't know why. They're certainly by no means against this stuff, but there have been other members that have advocated for this. Again, Bobby Scott, who is a member of the CVCs from Virginia, he took over George Miller's spot on the committee, so he's the top Democrat on the committee. Certainly his staff has been very helpful on this. But this hasn't been made a priority by the CBC, the Congressional Black Caucus, Congressional Hispanic Caucus, CHC. To my knowledge, a lot of their focus has been what we were calling has been more normal ed, I guess, to quote you earlier, Janet, and college. There's been a lot of focus on the post-secondary sort of work, access, completion, and stuff like that. So I don't know why this hasn't been picked up more. It hasn't been something that's hindered us in our work. So again, I think it goes to Kara's point. They're not against it by any means. It just hasn't risen to the priority there. I don't know the answer to your question, though, why it's not.
And some of our work and what we continue to try and do on the equity side of things is educate the members on how arts education is actually central to things like school improvement and things like college and career readiness and 21st century skills and how it plays into the larger picture of education. So I don't think, as Alex said, it's not an opposition. It's just in some cases they're not seeing the connections in the right way. And so that's part of our job, and what you all have charged us with is to move forward and kind of get that recognition.
And that's probably true of a lot of members of Congress. What we've primarily, our strategy all along has been to convince the key decision makers that actually write the bills. And those are the members we mentioned. Bobby Scott's a new entrant to the conversation, and so the process had kind of already started before he kind of got involved. But, the way, unfortunately, Congress works right now, it's not very democratic, but bills are generally written by a very small group of members, and members of Congress eventually vote on them, but they don't really have a whole lot of idea about what's in them. That may be it's kind of sad and funny at the same time. But the reality is that they're, Murray and Alexander's staff and Bobby Scott's staff and John Klein, he's the chairman of the House. We're in his home state right now. They're the most, like 95% the issue here, and they get it. And that's where we focused our work on. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned briefly the reauthorization of the Older Americans Act.
Mm-hmm.
That you're doing some work on that. Are you trying to introduce
Sure. We are trying to embed it in the legislation, and we've also been working with Congresswoman Bonamici on this as well, and trying to get interest from Congressman Scott and Congressman Klein and all of those big players we've been mentioning before. It sits in the same committee. That's the Education and Workforce Committee on the House side, and the Senate Health Committee, Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. So we are trying to get it embedded into Older Americans Act, and the way we've been looking at it is to have arts education as part of the state plans. So telling the states to provide some sort of technical assistance, and also in their own plans thinking about how they are going to have the arts and arts education as part of their plans for seniors in the state. So that's really working then with the local agencies. So they're the area agencies on aging. We're also working to embed it in that plan, so that they are not only actively thinking about how they think about arts education, but also how they can partner with organizations. So at that local level, we've really focused on the partnerships and making sure that we're building the capacity of the AAAs, the area agencies on aging, with those community partnerships for the arts, so that seniors have more opportunities and exposure. And then we've been looking at it in some of the senior centers. So there's funding for senior centers within the Older Americans Act, and we've been trying to embed it in things that those senior centers have to look at as part of their programs. But we've been trying to make it really robust. So not just saying, there's an arts class here or there, but actually meaningful arts and things that are going to help seniors. We've presented some great studies that Janet's helped us find on Alzheimer's and dementia and the work that's being done in this area, and I think it's great. And that has been, to Daniel's point earlier, what resonates, that has been resonating actually on both sides of the aisle. So.
Okay, any more questions?
What research do you need from us that would help you to fuel your engine?
I think one of the biggest challenges around this is some of the data issues we talked earlier. Richard was mentioning it, is like the Fast Facts survey that's used a lot, where it shows 94% of students in elementary school have some access to the arts. That is not necessarily helpful, because it goes into members of Congress. They go, well, what are we doing? Everyone gets it now. When in reality, there's a much different thing in terms of participation, economic, racial, and stuff like that. Data that breaks that down in a way that we can look at some of the equity issues would be very useful. There's this chart which some of us were laughing about earlier. I think Narek, we were talking about how there's issues with it, but that I use all the time. Which, again, we're trying to get people to move this and respond in a certain way. Whether the data is exactly scientifically set up to absolutely answer the question.
It's political data.
Yeah. So there's this great chart that, Narek, I think it's from your group, that shows the rate. Is it the one with the racial? We were talking about Daniel's presentation. It shows the racial inequity since 1982. People go, whoa. Because that is like, whoop, whoop. It's just, it's a little bit of whoop at the top. But that is an eye-opener for a lot of people. It's that sort of data that, unfortunately, is sometimes undermined when you get like a Department of Ed NCES report that says, 94% of all students have it. It's like, and we've had to explain that. Well, that's a different cut of the data. That's this, the other. It's, it's survey data. It's not, so it's a different sort of situation. If that helps you think about. Yeah, sure.
NCES report.
Yeah.
That report wasn't something the U.S. Department of Education wanted to do. It was mandated by Congress after hard-fought advocacy for $2 million to direct the Department of Education to take the temperature on the status of arts education. And the one slide you saw there actually kind of buries the lead, because that tells you how many kids are getting something.
Yes.
Some education. It's like how much or what quality. The big headline from that report was that the highest quality schools get the least access to arts.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And when the Secretary of Education was announcing his results, he said, this result tells us that arts education is a civil rights issue in our country that needs to be addressed. There's more we can do to bring that finding forward and carry through that narrative since
Absolutely.
And I just real quick wanted to add, we talked a little bit about the school improvement grants earlier and how that federal funding interacts with what Turnaround Arts is doing. And any data that you all have on programs that are being implemented in some of the lowest performing schools and helping to turn around those efforts is very helpful to us with ESEA, Elementary and Secondary Education Act reauthorization, because that's the purpose of the law. It's for equity, and it's also to improve these struggling schools. And so that piece of data is very important.
And there seems to be a real dearth of data. In fact, one time we took Janet to the Department of Education, and we were talking about the SIG program and the need to include the arts, and they were like, yeah, we know, we don't do a good job of that. Could you give us some data that shows that works? And Janet held her tongue, and we walk out of the building. She's like, really? I need to tell the U.S. Department of Education data? Don't they have the data somewhere? The answer is they may not, and that's part of the issue. To go back to your point, data is very important to tell these stories, and we've done a lot with what we have thus far. Part of me is always worried someone's going to ask too many questions with what we have. No one has yet, though, so that's good. Anyway.
But that's a good segue.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, guys.